Great, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whatever time zone we all might be in today. It's great to be here. Great to host this session as the moderator. I'm Stephen D'Onofrio, the program director of Ecosystem Marketplace at Forest Trends. We have a really fantastic session here today. Looking forward to introducing our speakers and having them give a chance to talk about who they are, the work that they do, and also to just give a very kind of intro answer to a question of what is biodiversity, and what is metrics, and how do you measure it? And so the mixture of perspectives here, coming from technology, coming from on the ground, coming from advisory and guidance, to corporates and the on the ground actors, I think will really kind of build upon the conversation that's been had so far already today, and also help to lead into additional conversations in this conference. So maybe just in terms of order, what I might do is first pass it over to Robin to give an introduction and answer that brief prompt of a question. Thanks, Robin.
Oh, happy to. Hi, everybody. So my name is Robin Loveridge. I work for the Biodiversity Consultancy. And the clue is really in the name. We're a group of biodiversity specialists, about 40 people who the organization has been running for about 15 years. And started off really, the trajectory of the organization really follows the ratcheting up and raising of corporate ambition on nature. So we started out helping corporates to manage biodiversity risks and dependencies with informing the development of the IFC Performance Standard 6, which is the kind of de facto international standard on managing biodiversity risks, particular application in the mining and agricultural sector. But as corporate ambition is raised, we've been advising companies much more on nature-based solutions and how they can deliver nature-positive outcomes. And so the work has really expanded into developing integrated corporate biodiversity strategies. But just to try and answer this quite thorny question around what is biodiversity, I think it doesn't have to be a very difficult answer. In fact, essentially biodiversity is composed of two components, species and ecosystems. There are two features that you would like to measure within those two components, and that's the diversity of species present, and the health, so whether a population is stable, increasing, and the condition of the ecosystem. Those are the readily measurable parts. And if you just will allow me just to build on that foundational point a little bit, I think what's interesting about biodiversity is, in contrast to carbon, this universal exchangeable unit, a carbon credit being 1 ton of carbon, whereas biodiversity being very place specific, very site based, and the composition of biodiversity at any place being quite different. And so it poses the interesting question of, well, what is the unit, and how do you look to aggregate biodiversity in a corporate context at the corporate scale, or allow you to make any kind of comparison between sites. And we're starting to see the development of really useful metrics that allow you to do that, certainly in terms of species. So one that we're particularly excited about is the STAR metric, stands for Species, Threat, Abatement, Restoration. And that allows you to aggregate scores. It's the first completely scalable metric for species that allows you to sit at the global scale. It essentially works as a stack of pancakes. You layer up the different species that are present, and the STAR score for any site is the height of the stack of pancakes, the different species that are present. And the height of each individual pancake depends on how threatened that species is. And then STAR scores are assigned based on actions to reduce the threats to that species. I think that's perhaps enough of an answer for starting off. I'm happy to pass.
That's great. Thank you, Robin. Yeah, and just to move swiftly along to the next round of panelists here, I'll shift over now to Paul Smith, and then we'll get into more of the technology and side of this panel. So Paul Smith with Conservation International, over to you.
Thanks, Stephen. Well, for full disclosure, it's Botanic Gardens Conservation International rather than CI. We're often confused. We are the professional association for the world's botanical institutions. So that includes Botanic Gardens. Our headquarters is at Kew, but we have offices in the US, in Singapore, China, and so on. And also forestry institutes, anywhere that basically that has botanical data, information, knowledge. It's worth saying also that the world's botanic gardens and arboretum grow about a third of known plant diversity. So 115,000 species, including 18,000 different species of trees. So there's a lot of knowledge in there about how to get positive outcomes for biodiversity, particularly in human transformed landscapes. But our probably best skill is in survey and inventory. And what botanic gardens have been doing for hundreds of years has been describing plant diversity, the taxonomy of plants, but based on specimens and collections and so on. And that botanical survey and inventory set of skills is appropriate to measuring biodiversity on a site-by-site basis, because as Robin says, biodiversity is not the same everywhere. It is context specific, and the other issue with the concept and what you actually measure is who measures it, because it's all very well having a framework like the STAR framework out there, but if you need specialists to come and measure it, then it's the outcomes, then it's really important that you are deploying the best people possible, and that they bring credibility with them, replicability, and also accessibility. So any metric needs to be ground truthed. If you're a corporate or a government or someone who's funding restoration or tree planting for carbon or whatever, you're not going to have the skills necessary to carry out any kind of impact assessment on the ground, which is context specific. So this is where our network comes in. We have around 60,000 plant scientists and horticulturists, and we are in the process of developing a global biodiversity standards certification with many partners, including the Society for Ecological Restoration, that would double up also as a mentoring service. So let's say, for example, we carry out an assessment, we find that you could be doing better for biodiversity outcomes by planting perhaps a different tree or a different set of trees. Next question is, how do you do that? And I think that's where we can bring in our horticultural expertise and knowledge to basically come up with better solutions for biodiversity.
Thank you, Paul. And also thank you for that clarification of Botanic Gardens, Conservation International. I shortened that, but I understand the conflict there. But that's really interesting, and I think that's what you hinted on here is something to come back to, is that metrics are not just metrics for the sake of quantification, but they're the aid for helping us manage things better. And so, for much of what I would consider to be transparency, and metrics being the enabler of transparency, is what will lead to better management, better utilization of land, better management of resources. So I think now we'll shift it over to Jessica from Climate Seed, and then follow up with Deborah from Maxar as the final intros. So Jessica, over to you.
Thanks, Stephen. Hello, everyone. I'm Jessica Denoyel, and I work at Climate Seed. Climate Seed is the climate action partner of organizations that are willing to, let's say, contribute to global carbon neutrality. And to do so, we offer quite a wide range of services, from carbon footprint assessments to our climate contributions, most widely known as voluntary carbon offsetting. And those projects that carbon credits, not only, of course, do they sequester or avoid greenhouse gas emissions, but they also have strong co-benefits that directly impact the UN SDGs. But what we call co-benefits in these carbon projects are often the primary benefits for the local communities where those projects are implemented. When designing and implementing projects that would generate carbon offsets, we should always take into account the social aspects and also the biodiversity ones, which is not always the case, unfortunately. Some methodologies make the, let's say, the biodiversity safeguards optional, whether we think it should be embedded in the project. And just to give you a concrete example, we are supporting a mangrove project in Mexico, in the Gulf of Mexico, in Yucatan. And it's a small fishing community composed of Mayan families. And 2 decades ago, there were 2 successive hurricanes in the area. It resulted in massive rainfalls. So the mangroves were flooded. There were less and less fish and less prawns, etc. And they took the initiative to restore the mangroves, to drain them. And they really quickly saw the benefits of the actions. At that time, the revenue per capita was below the country poverty line. And 20 years later, thanks to the restoring groves, the per capita income is twice as much as the national one. And so now they have more fish, they developed ecotourism, there are crocodiles, there are prawns, etc. And it paved the way for other communities to join the program, and we are extending it to those communities. And of course, they're not a goal per se for them. It's just a means for the improvement of their livelihoods. So we really think that in those projects, and that the voluntary carbon market is under scrutiny at the moment, there should be biologists and ecologists involved in the design of those projects to make sure that climate change and the carbon benefits of the project and the biodiversity benefits should go in the same directions as opposed to be opposed.
Thank you, Jessica. So, and we'll come back to that about how these metrics do get stacked and integrated, and what the ultimate value is created by having these benefits quantified and together on the same project, and also why in this conversation about quality of supply or integrity of projects, it also boils down to the methodologies being used, the quantification approaches, and ultimately the end purpose of the credits or of the projects. Maybe I'll shift it over to you, Deborah, from Maxar, to be the follow-up of the intros. But then I have a few questions here, and I do want to encourage the folks on the line to throw their questions into the chat or into the Q&A box. They are being sent to me, so thank you for those that are already coming in. But we do want to integrate these questions, as we go. So anyway, without further ado, over to you, Deborah.
Thank you, Stephen. From Maxar, what do we provide? We provide a view into the world. I've heard terms used throughout this morning's talk, such as remote sensing, boots on the ground, integrity, data. These are all things that Maxar can provide. We've been imaging the globe for the past 20 some odd years. We have a very robust archive of imagery over all the land masses for that period of time. And what we're trying to do is help people derive the insight that they can out of it, because there's so much hidden information and so much good information that you can derive out of it. Remote sensing, the word is in remote. When you need to get to places that you can't get boots on the ground easily, that's when you should rely on the satellite imagery. It tells you who's doing stuff, how it's being done, and when. We have the window into change management over time. And as the resolution increases in the future, as more satellites get launched, there's more of a variety of imagery to choose from. And this is very important because each different band of imagery, each different resolution gives you a different window into the world. It gives you the opportunity to see things from a different point of view. And it gives you the tools to measure. And that's what this is all about, is metrics and integrity of the metrics. And we need to prove through machine learning, through back testing, through benchmarking, that this is a viable contribution to these metrics. It was said earlier today, it's not just word of mouth and reports. People are looking for data-driven solutions. And that's where I feel remote sensing and the imagery comes into play. And there's all sorts of scattering of reports and news articles and articles in magazines and scientific publications about looking at both flora, fauna, and animals via remote sensing. So you can definitely derive the health of the environment from the biodiversity, not only in plants, but in the animals that are present. And this is also, obvious and change over time. A lot of people who come in and build plants that are emitters have to prove that throughout time they've returned the environment, or they haven't highly impacted the environment. And that's where such things as satellite imagery and remote sensing comes into play, because it is a third-party objective point of view about what the status of the environment has been over that time. Sometimes it's for the good and sometimes it's for the bad. But in any event, we have a record. So we definitely want to hear from the people who use the data, what type of data do you need? And that's what I'm hoping to get out of the session today, is how can remote sensing, how can imagery collectors and providers help in this climate change, sustainability, and world of metrics and measurement.
Thank you, Deborah. And if I could just maybe ask you a quick follow-up question, which is, satellite imagery has come down in cost over the years. There's more private satellites and other things. So it's not so much I think, an issue now about availability of the data or cost of the data, but I think from what I'm maybe trying to ask here is what is that decision point in which companies say, yes, we need to get this level of data because boots on the ground, is not enough? Is it have to do with, scale of land that you're dealing with, or, project size? Is it that there is a cost point that they do have to kind of get over to understand the value of the data? What does that spectrum look like from kind of the basic needs where, and then to where, Maxar would come in?
I think it all comes down to expertise and ease of use. That's what I found with my 7 years with Maxar and Digital Globe, is for remote sensors who are trained in remote sensing, they know how to use highly complex satellite imagery. For the more casual user, that's where it's a little more difficult. And that's where what we're trying to do at Maxar is create analysis ready data that is already geared to what you want to do. So I heard in a couple of talks this morning that they would much rather have layers of imagery that they can derive certain things out of. And that's one of our goals for the future, is making our imagery easier to consume. Because the more bands, the higher resolution, the heavier the files, and the more tools you need. What we want to do is simplify that. There are the casual users who just want to do visual analysis, and that's absolutely fine. You can count trees, you can look at the number of mangroves in their different states of evolution. But for the more savvy and remote sensing types, you can go then through the different bands of the data. So looking at chlorophyll layers, looking at healthy vegetation against non-healthy vegetation. And I think what the industry needs to do, and what a lot of the analytic houses who have already talked this morning need to do, is be able to turn this imagery into consumable layers are easier to integrate into the other data, into their platforms. And that's the difficult piece.
Got it. Thank you for that. And I'm thinking just about how to use the time on the panel today. The arc of the conversation here, I think, is we've already started off well on understanding some of the basics of what is biodiversity or what are some of those metrics. But I don't know if it's been kind of more as clearly stated as maybe we need in order to get into some other subsequent questions around policy, around how companies and investors, should pay attention to certain metrics. So maybe for all the folks in the panel, if you were to boil down, to some of the key metrics that always come into focus for you and the work you do with your clients, your partners, what would be some of the main metrics here, and how does it start to relate to some of the conversations we've had earlier today around carbon credit metrics and methodologies and standards? Because I think where we're maybe trying to get to is a place where this is standardized. We do have protocols or standards that can adhere to commonly understood and valued metrics. And so how far away are we from that point? So anybody want to take that question, go ahead.
I'm happy to start, give it a go, Stephen. I guess if you talk about an overall metric, given what we've already said about biodiversity and its context specific, site specific, and so on, it's what you're really looking for is ideally a net positive impact on biodiversity that will have various components. And I see in the questions here that have come in through the chat, for example, Jan-Philip Wassenaar asks about rigging the system by getting extra points by planting rare species. I think it's fine to get extra points by planting rare species, but that shouldn't be used to rig the system. If your overall impact is still negative, because let's say, for example, you've introduced a few rare and threatened species, but you are planting invasive species across tens of thousands of hectares, then that's a net negative. And that's really what we mean by context specific and site specific. This becomes more problematic if you're a company that's looking for biodiversity credits that might want to be traded, and Robin might talk about that in a moment. But at the site level, it is possible to carry out an objective, accessible, replicable assessment that says that for that site, the interventions which are being carried out are neutral, negative, or positive for biodiversity. Using remote sensing, which is useful for measuring things like cover, but also with the ground survey element as well, when you're getting into really much more diverse systems. For somewhere like Oxfordshire, fine, we can use remote sensing. I would argue we kind of know that there's 36 species of native UK trees and what they're going to be and what their biodiversity value is. If you're in the southeast of Madagascar, where you've got 90% endemism and you've got 1,000 species in their littoral forest that occur nowhere else, then you need a much more detailed assessment.
Robin, I see you're off mute. Would you like to go next?
Sure. I'd come in first on the question of the sort of standardization. So certainly we are seeing that coming down the track. I mean, so the science-based target network, the kind of emerging industry standard on how corporates will set targets for nature, will have a kind of beta version of a methodology for setting targets for biodiversity in the autumn of this year, with the full release next year. Likewise, CDP already has questions on biodiversity, which will be rolled out in full next year, and TNFD will have its full process for disclosing on financial risks on biodiversity in 2023. So collectively, they're seeing a great deal of standardization. Whether there will ever be a single metric for biodiversity, I think that's unlikely, as Paul has mentioned, just because of the site specificity, and in fact, I think that's probably a good thing. I would actually say, because we're on a panel, maybe just to be a slightly provocative, is that some of the perhaps unintended negative consequences of large-scale carbon projects has been from having this completely fungible, transferable unit of carbon that just completely uncouples carbon from its local context. I actually think it's really important to remain cognizant of the way that biodiversity and carbon are integrated and the social implications. And so having that place specificity is always going to be important. But at the same time, of course, to bring biodiversity to scale, we need to have these units that can be aggregated. And so I can see in the chat also this question around whether the metrics are suitable for the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And so, for example, the first target on that is, if I've got the wording right, I think it's the risk of species extinctions is half by 2050. And so we are now seeing these global units as well. So the STAR metric is directly designed to set that and to measure contributions towards that. And so I think these type of global units that are robust, that there isn't an endorsed standard for biodiversity yet, but there is several metrics which are well recognized and well respected and endorsed by large organizations such as IUCN. And these are really going to be the platform of how corporates can take action for nature. And I think the point around whether the metrics are a barrier, I think it's slightly a moot point now. I think the metrics are actually up to the task. It becomes much more about a company delving a little bit into how your company has particular risks and dependencies on nature and understanding those. And the metrics are available once you've identified the key areas of biodiversity you want to focus on. And so I guess the takeaway would be, do start looking into it and do start taking action. I think at the moment there isn't a need for kind of fear of doing something wrong because the standardization isn't crystallized. I think it's quite clear that anything you're doing is at the moment something to be championed and celebrated. But very quickly in the next few years, we'll reach a point where there is an expectation that companies will be doing something for nature, and if you aren't, then there will be a sort of naming and shaming that will happen. But that's kind of 5-10 years down the track. So at the moment, we're in this kind of sunset period of being able to take positive action without too much flack or negative consequences. It's a real opportunity to explore and to take bold steps. And there are plenty of companies out there who can help to guide that process, to manage risks and maximize the opportunities.
Yeah, I appreciate those examples and the from both of you and the kind of the emphasis on site specificity. And maybe to tee off of that, to go back on to the technology side and maybe bring Deborah and potentially Jessica also back in to talk from these perspectives of, how do we marry up the data that can be collected on the ground through physical measurement to the kind of the spectrum of visible light, two-dimensional imagery to really detailed imagery that provides ground to canopy type of information. How does that link up on that site specific level? Are there ways that we're already able to create more harmonization, even if they have site specific metrics? So maybe just hand it over to you, Deborah, to take it from there.
Sure, yeah, and that's one thing. Whenever we do any of our studies, we always ground truth it. We're not going to rely on machine learning alone. We're not going to rely on analysts sitting in an office alone. Our analysts do have experience in working in certain environments. They've been out, they've seen the on the ground examples, and then they take that knowledge and marry it to the satellite imagery and the other data sources. I mean, we also bring in handheld data. We bring in anything that we can find out in the public domain, as well as what companies can provide us from what they've collected over their sites. So we're never going to just hold our hats on technology alone. The manual component is very important. When you get to being able to defend your numbers, though, the objective third-party piece is very important as well. So we have to do a balancing act, if you will. And the most important thing is to understand the detail that the study is trying to achieve. The whole thing about being compliant for regulations, it's the old adage, it helps to be able to build those regulations so that you know you have the means to be compliant for them. The other issue, the opposite of that is regulations are put upon organizations that there's no way of being compliant because there's no way to collect the data in an accurate and measured sense that you can meet those regulations and be compliant. So that's been going on for years, whether it's been emissions, EPA, human labor, etc. It's always, it's a hard thing to comply to. And I've said comply a lot because that's what this is all about. At the end of the day, when everybody was doing corporate social responsibility, it was, what can I do to look like I'm being the best that I can, as not to hurt my brand. Now it's becoming more specific, especially with climate change, greenhouse gases, environmental, deforestation, reforestation, and the best use of land. I think where remote sensing and manual intervention come really into play is where countries, especially in Africa, are trying to increase the standard of living for their people by giving them jobs via farming, giving them food via farming, and giving them the ability to borrow against that new investment they have, the farm, the future production, so that they can grow the infrastructure and grow the communities. And I think that's where a lot of the remote sensing comes into play. We can look at historically what grows best in what environments, and then we add in the extra value of what nutrients need to be given, how much water needs to be given, all the agricultural inputs, the agronomists' information and expertise to make this succeed.
Thanks, Deborah. Jessica, I'd like to maybe offer to kind of loop you back in if there's anything that you wanted to say that was missed here.
Yeah, well, I think we all agree that technology can be very helpful to monitor and verify projects, not only in terms of carbon, but also for biodiversity. But we still need to involve all the stakeholders, to train them, to make sure they are empowered. And it's not with technology that you can do it. So it's very useful, it's very powerful, but it will not replace our training on the ground and our awareness across the communities that are directly impacted by those projects.
Got it. Thanks, Jessica. So there's kind of two themes I want to. Well, go ahead.
No, I was just saying that, so many organizations are currently measuring their carbon footprint, in some cases because they are obliged to do so. It can be quite a challenge to cover the whole scope 3. So let alone biodiversity. We've seen more and more investment funds that are offsetting the residual emissions of their portfolio. To my knowledge, there is no fund at the moment that is trying to balance its impact on biodiversity. And some organizations have designed an environmental profit, but there are only very few of them at the moment. And I hope it will become mainstream, like carbon footprint. Thanks,
Jessica. Yeah, I've heard this reporting is, I'm from the corporate side, is becoming, I guess, standardized or being integrated into disclosure systems. I'm a former CDP employee, so I understand the value of corporate disclosure and transparency and having, global standardization on that. But I think there's sort of the, what kind of we keep coming back to, at least I keep coming back to, is the value of quantification, of having the right metrics, which then can be used for reporting and disclosure. And also, along with that is making sure we are able to value biodiversity. So, having the best metrics gets us part of the way there, understanding, what that, and going back to some comments Deborah was making around comply versus, voluntary action. I wonder if the panel could maybe talk a bit about, what is compliance when dealing with biodiversity and tracking for biodiversity and impacts, as well as, benefits or opportunities from biodiversity safeguards, while also thinking about kind of the voluntary action. And then, the last maybe piece here I'll dangle is the price that people keep talking about, that we have a price on carbon. We do have a price on carbon, but it spreads. The spread is from less than 50 cents per ton to over $200 a ton on a price per carbon. So, the market values carbon not in isolation, but, when you build on top of it all these other attributes, SDGs or co-benefits such as biodiversity and communities. So I think where we can find opportunities could be in harmonization or in bringing integration of different ecosystem service values together, so that maybe multiple objectives can be accomplished in one investment or one purchase of credits. So I'll put that out to you all, thinking through those different points, and anybody who have a response to those, that'd be great.
Yeah, let me start again with that, Stephen. I think absolutely. I would argue that it's good management to combine those assets. And in fact, there's a question which has come through in the chat from Giancarlo Rascio asking about local people, indigenous people, and so on. You cannot manage biodiversity. You can't sequester carbon or produce commodities without the involvement of local communities. It's very, very difficult to do that if they are against whatever your intervention is. So I think, again, when we talk about local context and we talk about local value chains and we talk about resilience, all of those things, it makes sense to be thinking about and building into your design the local aspects, whether those are socioeconomic or whether those are biodiversity, just to enable you to manage that portfolio effectively. You need to bring people with you. Ideally, what we see in the tree planting and restoration area is that you're using local value chains, local nurseries are supplying material of the right provenance. People have a stake in it, so it's not all top down. There needs to be a top-down element, which is objective and and credible, and some of that can be provided by remote sensing, looking at things like cover. But for day-to-day management and design, it needs to be all very integrated. Otherwise, it's simply not going to work. And that's voluntary at this point. I mean, your compliance thing might be do no harm to biodiversity, or you might get a license from the government saying you can develop this area, but these are the conditions. But the really important stuff is that, as I say, is that you work with local stakeholders to make sure that it's a success.
Paul, anybody else want to follow up on that?
I mean, I completely agree with the need to do something which is locally appropriate and embedded within local values. I was going to follow up on a separate point that you made around the distinction between the regulated versus the voluntary market. So perhaps just to clarify, in terms of, it's come up a few times in the discussion in the earlier sessions also about this idea of a biodiversity credit, and the market for this. So there's two kind of distinctions there to be made, really. The first being the difference between a regulated credit and a voluntary credit. So, for example, here in the UK, we now have a national net gain strategy, so that new housing development projects are required to deliver a net gain, and so there's a regulated market for biodiversity credits that's becoming it's fast becoming mature here in the UK, and other countries such as South Africa or Australia and the United States have similar systems. So that's around compliance with national regulations. But then beyond that, what's perhaps more exciting is companies looking to be nature positive, to make nature positive investments, and that's on a purely voluntary basis. So then it's looking at investments which are structured and defensible and credible, and it comes down to what evidence is robust enough to provide good investor confidence that you're doing something which is positive for biodiversity and not necessarily harming any social issues or for carbon. And that's where we're seeing a lot of growth. So whether there will ever be one universal biodiversity credit, because of all the things we've discussed about place specificity, I'm a little bit skeptical of, but we are seeing habitat specific credits. So there's a development of a wildflower credit for here in the UK. There's a development of a coral reef credit globally. So there are these kind of banks and ways that you can increasingly will be able to invest in nature, make these positive investments that are becoming a kind of industry standard, a way that you can do that in a structured way with measured returns. And I think, to emphasize, I think the metrics are there, but that is just enough to provide a level of quality assurance. And I do think that the metrics for biodiversity are complementary to those from carbon, but currently, from what I'm seeing, there are good carbon standards. So CCB, that's been mentioned earlier, is probably the best for biodiversity. But even so, those metrics are primarily targeting carbon, which is quite distinct from biodiversity. And so there is a need for development of biodiversity specific measurements to give that peace of mind to investors that there is going to be a positive return for biodiversity. I think the metrics are there, and the standards are coming. It's partly a question of how to accelerate this. It just needs a little bit more investment in these public goods, because it is a public good to have these standards in place. And that's the challenge in how to scale this, is really getting that kind of architecture in place for biodiversity that's similar to carbon. And we're probably in a place right now where the standardization for biodiversity is around 10 to 15 years behind where carbon was. So we will see the kind of rapid development of these kind of standardization over the next few years. And again, as been mentioned on a previous panel, that there will be lots of different biodiversity standards emerging, but I think it is also important, as I think Ed mentioned on a previous panel, that there is this kind of there aren't too many different ones, and that will be even harder for biodiversity given its greater complexity. And so the next immediate building blocks are probably to develop a standard, for a flexible standard for biodiversity credits, and then to sit below that particular standards for particular aspects of biodiversity.
Thanks, Robin. I want to spend maybe, I know we have about 10 minutes left for the session. I want to spend a little bit of time on the demand side of this equation. And I guess maybe just looking at some of the questions that have come through here, and also to kind of think more broadly, when we try, there's a lot of folks trying to relate carbon markets to biodiversity markets. And we've at Forest Trends, we've tracked these markets, all different types of markets for ecosystem services over the years, from biodiversity to water to carbon. The benefit of carbon is a international kind of fungibility, in a sense, of carbon emissions. Whereas water markets, biodiversity markets are, as we've been talking about here, locally relevant, locally unique. But there is a need for us to think more broadly about how to make those appealing or attractive from the demand side perspective, even if you don't necessarily have operations or supply chains in certain areas where that biodiversity value is extremely high and the risk of loss is extremely high. So how do we kind of frame this in a way where It's not necessarily biodiversity for the sake of biodiversity, but is it linked to sustainable development goals? Is it linked to other ambitions from a corporate, outside of compliance? I think a lot of these demand side questions I'm seeing are more from a voluntary perspective. So I thought I'd throw that out there to start this piece on, and maybe use that to also spill into Maxar, which, Deborah, if you could also talk about this from the data is data because it is intelligence about, location, but it's also part of a company's ability to tell a story, with credibility of information. And I think technology has a strong role to play in that as well. So over to you all, whoever wants to go first. Maybe Jessica or Deborah, since Robin and Paul have been the more recent speakers here. Go ahead, Jessica.
No, maybe Stephen, yeah, just to comment on the demand side. It's true that at the moment we are seeing more demand for carbon credits than for biodiversity ones. Because what happens is that organizations, they do the best that they can to reduce the emissions in the first place, but it takes a long time to decarbonate a business. And for those residual emissions, they want a corresponding number of carbon credits. That said, some carbon standards are developing biodiversity credits on a standalone basis, so not something on top of carbon credits. They are already plastic credits, so there would be biodiversity credits. And there is this summa divisio of carbon credits, avoidance credits. And what we've seen is that it would be the same split between credits that would avoid an anticipated loss in biodiversity and credits that would uplift biodiversity. But again, we don't know at what price those biodiversity credits will be sold. It's hard to tell, because we would have thought that our uses for carbon offsets would be that high now. for biodiversity credits, it's a new market, it's new demand. So nobody can tell, but I can tell you that our clients, when they are looking for carbon offsets, they want something consistent with their activity. So where they have the providers or the customers, etc. And I think that would be the same for biodiversity. Would be consistency. There should be consistency with the value chain of their contributors.
Deborah, would you like to jump in?
Sure. I think the interesting thing with biodiversity is there's so much different types of information in the satellite imagery that you can unlock. We really need to define exactly what you're trying to do. Is it just to look at change over time with the different types of animals that are in the environment? Are we seeing a increase in species or seeing a decrease in species? Are we just going to track one species? There's a lot of studies that have been focused on whales and elephants and yaks. We've done studies where communities in Africa are more of a tribal nomadic way of living. So we had to do studies where we were tracking the tribes and the number of pigs that they had in the tribe. And the company was trying to prove and meet the arrangements with the local government for working in the area to prove that the wealth of the tribe was increasing because the number of pigs were increasing, because that was a measure of wealth. So it gets down to what is the measurement, what are you trying to measure as far as biodiversity? With forests and deforestation, with agriculture, is it the increase in the number of different crops? Is it the land use, how you're using the land to best grow crops to make the most return on your investment. That's all doable. That's one of the curses of satellite imagery. There's so much information locked away and different ways of getting it, all the way from visual to looking at the different wavelengths and extracting information that way. So you really have to sit down and think what you're trying to do. And most likely during the course of your project, your focus is going to change over time, because you're going to find new things that you didn't know were possible earlier in the project. But the beauty is you can always go back and relook at it, because it's there, it's in an archive, it's there for your future use. Also the interesting thing is, with more satellites being launched and more the constellations growing, our number of revisits per day is going to increase. And that's just going to give a huge explosion of data to give you many more data points. Because what people will go and say was, oh, well, on that day you measured it, it just happened to be that all the species you were looking at were in one location, and it wasn't during the migration, or it was during the migration. So I think that's where the explosion of satellite technology is really going to become much more useful. And it's going to be the onus of the collectors to be able to make that imagery available on a very easy to use basis, because it's going to have just much more power as we have more collects per day.
Yeah, really interesting. And I think the technology, like you said, is only improving. More and more satellites being launched, better data, more consumer grade or corporate grade data from, what would typically been locked up in government grade. So I think that's a really exciting area to keep watching. And there's so many other questions, I think, here related to technology that I'm sure you might get follow-up questions on, Deborah, from the audience. But, we do have just about a few minutes left. So I think what I'd like to just ask everybody if there's any kind of final thoughts here. And that's one of those really kind of, crummy questions to ask panelists at the end of a session, because there's so many final thoughts. But, I just think that this is a really important market for people to understand and to try to wrap their heads around, because it is not something that can be pushed off for 10 years or 20 years and then dealt with then. I mean, we're losing biodiversity at alarming rates, just like we're losing nature. So how do we escalate this, issue to the point where the value is understood? It is not compartmentalized, as a, carbon's already kind of pushed off. Carbon markets are already pushed off into this, kind of last, result or last action type of thing from a climate perspective. But how do we bring these markets into more of part of the strategy, especially in the near term, as we deal with better policies and regulations and compliance mechanisms, which is, I think, ultimately what we need down the road. But how do we reprioritize these markets, and especially biodiversity, get people up speed, really fast, just like we're trying with carbon, so that they understand it, they can embed it into businesses, they can embed it into, strategies for sustainable development, globally. Thoughts, anybody? And if you want to deviate from that, feel free, but final thoughts here from the panelists.
Okay, let me finish with a final thought related to that. I think for the time being, at least, the biodiversity in terms of business is framed in risk rather than opportunity, but that risk is related to reputation, and reputation depends on public perceptions. And I think the fact that biodiversity is moving up the public agenda, I mean, 2 years ago, we had the Pope produce an encyclical on biodiversity saying we have no such right to cause extinctions. I mean, it is getting much more mainstream, and society cares about it. Young people care about it. And I think the more we move in that direction, the greater the reputational risk related to causing harm to biodiversity. Final thing to say, as we said all the way through, it will be context specific. I'll give you one final quick example. Rio Tinto, when they were working down in southeast Madagascar, did due diligence. They had assessments carried out for their mining concession. There were 54 native plant species in their mining concession that occurred nowhere else on the planet. That is a risk specific to Rio Tinto and to that specific site that needed to be managed. Hence a net positive impact approach to that site. I think, for the time being, that is the scenario, that it's going to be context specific, site specific, and related to risks. But over time, compliance is coming. And the more we're prepared for that, the better, I think.
I'm happy to chip in. So in terms of how do we accelerate action on this, I think there's, as mentioned previously, there's an opportunity in the next few years for corporates to really step up and to lead the agenda on this. So, and the way to do that is at the corporate level, setting that top-down direction, largely through developing a corporate biodiversity strategy. And that can be quite a simple document. It starts with understanding your ecological balance book. So looking at what your impacts on biodiversity are, setting targets at the corporate level, and then taking action and monitoring that progress over time, learning from what you're doing. And it's just having the initiative to start that journey. And we're seeing lots of the big corporations in sectors spanning, the primary production sectors, but also into big tech and luxury fashion brands across the board. Companies are starting to take action, and so there's a lot of learning and industry-specific roundtables to be involved in. So tooling up and engaging in these kind of conversations as we're having today is a great starting point. But setting clear signal within your companies that you're serious about this and plan to take action.
Yeah, and I guess what I'd like to leave the panel with is the following thought. Try to think out of the box. Try to think of what use cases you need to solve, how what you want to measure as far as biodiversity is concerned, and think about using remote sensing and satellite imagery. You've got multiple participants here in the program for today and tomorrow that do analytics. Just go to them, come to me, send out questions, because you'll be surprised at what can be done with geospatial data and combining all sorts of types of data together to help in situations like this. And, it's something we have to solve quickly. And I think we have a lot of the resources and available today, and we just need to link them together and bring it to a relevant use case that will make an impact on both the public and the commercial sectors.
Deborah, thank you. That's great. And final thoughts for you, Jessica, and then we'll close the panel just a couple minutes late. Thanks.
Well, I think that when using nature-based solutions, we should always bear in mind the recommendations of the IPCC joint report on biodiversity and climate change. Please do not only focus on carbon sequestration, or at least take into account all the aspects of a project. Have a holistic view, involve biologists, ecologists, etc. Because those issues cannot be tackled independently. They should be addressed jointly.
Amazing. Yeah, I think some really fantastic messages here in closing, but all throughout this session. Virtual applause for our panelists. It's always more gratifying when you're in person, you can hear that applause, but thank you very much to my team here. Really excellent. We'll hand it back over to Warren and the folks organizing the conference to carry us on to the next session. Thank you so much. Have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.